And then this all leads into the idea of what's called dynamic roles. So in a dynamic role, what you have is often what happens is a typical example of a dynamic role is you have exchange servers, for example. So you actually may have like a dozen exchange servers in your organization, and you might assign people to different exchange servers based on their, say, location or department. So the idea is that attribute determines which exchange server you connect to. So this is the idea of dynamic role. So you look at the attribute, and from that you figure out what things they should connect to. So one thing that would be interesting is sort of discovering those dynamic roles, figuring out how different roles might be related by these dynamic ideas. And I think that's all I have. So thanks. I'm ready to take questions.
So are you just using the core RBAC?
Right. Yeah, good question. So yeah, we've certainly thought a lot about hierarchies. Right now we're just using core RBAC as the short answer. What happens is, so I think the hierarchy stuff may fall out of this in kind of a natural way. So at the end of the day, what you're going to have is a set of roles which are basically going to correspond to permission sets. As with one of the papers I mentioned earlier, the permission sets can be thought of as sitting in a lattice. And a lattice is sort of a natural way of thinking about a hierarchy, a role hierarchy. So it might be possible, for example, to infer relatively straightforwardly what the role hierarchies are just from the permission sets. We've also done some work, which I haven't described today, of trying to do role discovery from a bipartite graph to a tripartite graph to a quadripartite graph and so on by just successively doing role discovery on the intermediate layers and then doing some optimizations in between. And that's been interesting, but the problem with that has been, and that may relate to hierarchies, but the problem with that is those results are extremely hard to interpret. They're just, when you discover multi-partite graphs, it's sort of hard to put any semantics around what you're discovering at all.
What about the distribution of arcs?
Right. So
is there any, let me say,
any structure?
Any distribution is an exponential normal?
Right. Yeah. That's a good question. So the question was about the distribution of the arcs that come out of the roles, basically, right?
Also,
it could be. I mean, because you have multiple out degree depending on whether you're going users to roles to permissions. Detail I haven't tried to do estimation of what how well they fit various kinds of distributions or anything like that. Eyeballing some of the distributions we have, they do follow these pretty regular kind of distributions. They do look exponential or something, or maybe geometric or something. I haven't figured out exactly what they are. One of the things that's problematic with this kind of approach is a lot of times you end up discovering roles that have one user and many permissions, or completely useless, right? Because effectively what you've done is you've just replaced a role with something. You're not improving the manageability of the thing at all. You're just now you're managing a role instead of managing a permission. That's not very helpful. And in fact, that's one of the problems when we look at this the algorithm where we start with the max out degree. What happens if you start with the max out degree, you get a whole bunch of permissions. Often that'll be thousands, and there's very few users who have all 5,000 of those permissions. One user and 5,000 permissions, which is one of the reasons why we went to the minimum degree node, because that actually, as long as you're not picking a node with degree 1, that's another bad thing to do. So that's kind of a long, rambling non-answer to your question, but
because consideration was what about clustering of users who access rights?
Right.
Rights.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I'm looking at. That's one of the things we're looking at right now.
An hypothesis, at least, about clustering.
Yeah.
Would give some useful information.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's what we're looking at right now, and we're trying to figure out the best clustering techniques to use here. And we have some ideas. Actually, I had a nice conversation this afternoon with somebody who was pointing me at some co-clustering stuff, which would be useful. Yeah, Chris.
Yeah. Wondering, addressing this last problem, if you were to, instead of saying, okay, we're going to go from a bipartite, allowed edges from user to permission, this last problem you point out, if you did edge minimization, it would go away because you'd say, well, I've got a user to roll to n permissions.
Right.
Well, I can just replace that with n permissions.
Yeah.
And admittedly, you've taken an NP-hard problem and made it harder, but would this possibly get rid of some of these spurious roles?
Yeah, I think a hybrid, you end up with sort of like a hybrid role and traditional access control model, which I think is absolutely probably a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Roles serve very unique roles, for lack of a better word, in an organization. You use roles for very specific things, but a lot of times there's exceptions to those roles. And there's often individuals in your organization who have very unique access control requirements, and maybe it doesn't a role hierarchy. So you might actually want to have some meaningful roles, some hybrid of some meaningful RBAC system and some sort of non-RBAC-like system. And is that what you're getting at?
And perhaps more important, does that get you closer to roles that have interest in semantics? Because how many of these extraneous or exceptional situations are really users who have such a situation, and how many of them
That's exactly the problem, and that's exactly it, and that's what's, in some sense, that's what this noise problem is all about that I was talking about. And so I think a lot of it are both. It's like a poorly maintained ACL can lead to these things. You see all the time in these systems people who have access rights who haven't been with the company for 5 years. That kind of thing happens all the time, and so you of ACLs, that's a huge problem, and there's just weird people who have exceptional circumstances, and they're sort of outliers to this whole thing too. So, again, that's when when I talked about this idea of exposing noise in the system. That's the kind of thing that the first thing you look at when you do this role discovery is you look at the extremes of what you discover. You find the biggest roles, the roles with most number of users and most number of permissions, because it's like, hey, those are probably the really important users and 100 permissions, and that's probably something meaningful, right? And those are the first ones we go after, and that's sort of like the low-hanging fruit that you can look at and find something meaningful on. The noise in the system is all the outliers, the stuff at the bottom, where you have one user with 2 permissions, these like small weird sets that don't seem to correspond to anything else, or you find often permissions where there's only a handful of people who have these permissions, and so the feedback we get is, that's probably noise, So you have those two.
just remove the permissions and wait till they scream.
And find out and wait till they scream, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Bill.
All right, thank you.